I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today from Translators Without Borders, Mirko. Got that right, I hope. I never say your last name, it's so funny. It's the first time I'm like, oh yeah, I don't think I've ever said this. I've known, actually Mirko and I have known each other for a number of years. He had worked with Autodesk and was actually one of the first adopters of the Hub, and one of our first enterprise clients for the Hub. The Hub, if you recall, started as a tool for language communities to build machine translation engines, and it's now become a tool for a lot of language service providers and other businesses. And what Mirko had done, and he did a very interesting study, actually. He had looked at, he wanted a metric that gave him a better impression of the utility of the MT rather than the quality of the MT. So a lot of our focus in MT circles is on blue or on human evaluation. We're always looking at ways to look at the quality, the extrinsic quality or the comparative quality of the translations. And he wanted to ask a different question. It's like, were the translations actually useful to my clientele? And this became a really crucial question because some of the folks, like the Turkish-speaking folks, if I recall, and the Japanese-speaking folks, had no access to the content if they didn't have translation. And Autodesk, for the most part, wasn't going to translate all of their help content into all of these different languages. So they used MT to translate into a large number of these languages and then provided that material online. And I think your results were actually quite good. And I believe they mirrored, Chris Wendt did a study on this a few years before. And I think you gave a talk, if I recall, on this. I can't remember.
I'm trying to think back as well, but it probably shouldn't branch out into that. But it's true, Microsoft was probably the first one back in 2000 or 2001 to really do a study and come up also with this tiered approach of mixing human translation where it made sense, where it was needed, and machine translation as a kind of a first tier. Yeah, that was very inspirational. We were certainly among the first ones to try to apply that in our situation.
We really liked the study. Anyway, I was really impressed by it, and it gave more fuel to this alternate way of assessing MT, not looking at just the quality metric, looking at another metric. I think that's quite useful, and I think that was a case study that we had used for quite a number of years. But anyway, that's our point of reference. And, so this goes back quite a few years, actually. But I won't go through all of the stuff in his bio because you can read the bio. But Mirko does have a background in machine translation, does have a background in computational linguistics. He has recently joined Translators Without Borders. He just arrived this year, as a matter of fact. And I was very happy. It was funny because Diane said, there's a new director of
technology.
Technology, thank you. I was trying to get the right word there. And she says, Mirko, and I'm like, Mirko? I know Mirko. So it's like, okay, no problem. And she says, you know him? And I says, of course I know him. And then, anyway, it's my pleasure to introduce Mirko to MSR to give a talk today on, and the title, a translation NGO's view on language technology trends. Thank you.
Thank you, Will, for the very kind introduction. Oh, thank you. So just very quick. So my role is head of technology at Translators Without Borders, and as you said, I joined actually in June this year. So it feels. Probably from the industry context, it looks like that's very recent. In the humanitarian context, where things move very fast as well, at a pace that is sometimes really frantic, it actually makes me already one of the more senior members of the team. Interestingly, and my background is computational linguistics, and with a focus really having been, and utility I think was the right term that used on how useful technology can be, and I think that fits very well into my mission, into my role at Translators Without Borders. But I'm not going to talk more about myself, but rather about Translators Without Borders. some key numbers. So we're a volunteer-driven non-profit organization that mainly supports humanitarian organizations. We also take part in certain programs with grants that we receive as sometimes as part of consortia, say with the UN or with different refugee councils in Europe, or say Paul Allen Foundation as well. But our main focus is really to work and support humanitarian organizations in their work, and the core of our activities is around volunteer translators. So we have a base, an active community of more than 3,000 volunteer translators. We've worked in 180 languages. Of course, the type of languages we work into are driven by the needs. It's not typically the language that the industry works into. So it's a very different, and for me as a computation linguist, also very exciting aspect of the work is actually we work with very different languages, and they're not just different in terms of linguistic properties, but also in terms of say social aspects, in terms of conditions, if there's written data, for instance, or not, and social aspects, literacy, and so on. And yeah, we've translated to this year 37 million words. So that's just some key numbers. I will show a short video that introduces, gives a brief overview of some of our activities. It's a short video, it's about three minutes. I'll just let this run without commenting on it. So I guess I should do this. Okay. And will the sound play then as well? So this video gave you, kind of an overview of, the diversity of activities that as an organization we have, and of course the common denominator across these, the way we interact. Oh, sorry.
I was wondering if that was.
Oh, okay, that's of course, yeah, usual thing. The common denominator in our activities is, translations, but also beyond that, language in general. And so what I'm going to talk about is, or I'll take maybe a little bit of a step back to take another angle and say, just thinking of a language barrier. Language really can be thought of as a human right. It is actually part of it is actually considered a human right as part of the UN. I forgot to put the quote there, but it is officially recognized as a human right, and it is maybe also, it's not just a reality that complicates our lives, but it's actually that defines us as human beings, as social beings. The fact that we speak in different languages is not a coincidence. It is actually just like we, tend to dress differently, or like our children speak slightly different, use different terms for certain things than we do. It's a human. It's something that is an essential part of our human identity, is that we organize ourselves in groups, in distinct groups. And language is a very powerful way for us to actually define these groups and our belonging to groups. And that's also what makes it a human right. That's what I meant here by language variety, is the result of our innate need to define ourselves as members of distinct groups. And not just a problem that we need to solve. So a term that we often hear in the localization industry is long-tail languages. There are arguably about 6,500 languages. You get, when you look for it, you get very different numbers. It's generally in the thousands. But the fact that this number is not very precise is not only because it's difficult to find all the people who speak different languages and to count it. It's actually the definition of languages itself is problematic and is essentially political. The difference between dialect and language, but also sometimes within a language, it's the same language but written in different scripts, or different communities may speak the same language but define themselves as different communities, and consider therefore their languages as different. So it's sometimes very debatable whether something is a different language or not. But let's just settle for this number of 6,500 languages. It's not just an impressive number. It's each language has its own community, its own history, its own social reality that comes with it. And it defines the challenges as well that for instance, we need to address when we think of languages as a factor of humanitarian action. So in the humanitarian world, we sometimes talk about disaster-prone language communities, where the vulnerability of communities is not limited to the exposure to certain risk itself, but in addition, there's this communication challenge, because the help that these communities need to receive from the outside is delivered in languages that these communities may not speak. I mean, it seems maybe obvious, but so it's not just a question of diversity and number. There are certain factors that are just specific challenges in the humanitarian world. Practically, maybe just again thinking about this aspect of it being a human right, diversity. We also know that in the industry, diversity is a value, and language is a very important aspect of cultural diversity, and that's why we should value it as well. So 6,500 languages, many of them these so-called long-tail languages, what does it actually mean? You know, we're not just talking about languages that happen to have, you know, not yet reached the same, say, technological development as other languages, and we just need to add them as soon as there's a business case. But the language reality of each of these languages can look very differently. So I just chose two examples here where Translators Without Borders has been active or involved. Guinea, for instance, in West Africa, is a country with 8 million inhabitants and 40 languages. It's not uncommon in the world to have this language variety. You know, coming, say, from a more Western context, it seems surprising, but it's actually not that exceptional. Also, historically, it's not exceptional for humankind to speak such an incredible variety of languages. The official language in Guinea is French, but French is only spoken by about 20% of the population. So, you know, which highlights immediately the difficulty of actually bringing information across or enabling communication. And the most widely spoken language in Guinea is Fula, which is written in several scripts, not just written in Latin scripts, but also in Arabic scripts and in several scripts that have been developed within the different communities themselves. So, which, as you know, coming from a tech context, you can imagine what that involves in terms of complication and sophistication. And to complicate matters further, Fula and all these languages, except for French, are not taught in school. And there is no, in many of these countries, there is no, say, political will to actually support the language diversity. You know, there is an official language that has a certain status and function in the running of a country that doesn't necessarily help the traditional languages of the communities. Another example here is Mozambique, which is slightly bigger in terms of inhabitants, has 26 million inhabitants and also about 40 languages spoken there. The official Portuguese there is spoken by about half of the population, mainly in urban areas. That's of course also something we see a lot in the world. You know, that there's a difference between the urban areas and rural areas. And if we're thinking of health crises, but also other crises, they often affect more the rural areas. So even if we were able to rely on 50% of the population who speak Portuguese, the people who are most likely, if you will, disaster-prone populations, you know, we would not be able to reach them in Portuguese. Plus, literacy is at 50% in this case. These are numbers from the most recent numbers I could find from UNESCO. They're several years old. That's also one of the challenges that some of the language data, the linguistic information is not necessarily reliable, not necessarily up to date. Complicating matters further here, literacy of women is half of that of men. That's also not uncommon. So literacy is not only an issue with the general population, but it actually penalizes particular sections of the population as well. So I mean, these are, you know, it's not just a question of saying we want to support, say, Fula in terms of technology. We just need to add it. You know, it costs us maybe money or engineering time to add, say, machine translation. You know, to what we support in terms of technology. It's actually much more complex than that. We need much more better understanding of the actual needs of people if we want to provide them with access to information. So how, as Translators Without Borders, how we deal with or how we try to help with these situations is obviously our role is to play a role of advocacy within the countries themselves sometimes, but also among humanitarian organizations who have a varying degree of awareness of the language dimension of their work and the impact it can have on the effectiveness of what they're doing, and also beyond, say, in the tech industry, on the localization industry as well, where I come from, or where we as an organization originate. And then we train translators. That's a very important activity of ours. A lot of these countries don't have a translation infrastructure at all. And there is not, say, an industry or business case that would justify, say, a tradition or the creation of professional translation programs. So that's a role that we try to play where it makes sense, like in Guinea, for instance, where we've just been running a program of translating health-oriented translators. But that also means that we may, define specific strategies to train different types of translators, but also define different processes in order to support the communication, the flow of information. So here I mentioned simplification of content. So the project that we're running at the moment in Guinea involves the training of translators whose background is rather medical, so nurses, for instance, and doctors, rather than your typical linguist, as maybe who we would work with in, say, in European countries or in more mature Asian countries. And the process involves something that's actually quite sophisticated, which is a simplification with technology support, in order to enable or ensure that the information that people receive can actually be understood, and doesn't require skills or level of, say, medical experience that the target audience may not have. And something that leads more into my role now is, we're developing and spreading awareness of technological implications in terms of the language reality. So you could argue that there is, in general, technology, of course, has this aspect of creating somewhat of an equal base of opportunities for everyone in the world. That's kind of an idealistic view of technology, and in essence, that's certainly true. But it's not quite as always as easy as that. But let's maybe first talk about the things where technology seems to play this role and where technologies do converge. So, internet is something that really is global and in principle accessible. I mean, in theory accessible. In terms of technology, it would be possible, and at some point will be possible that everyone can access it. I mean, the technology itself does not prevent that possibility. Also, the mobile is a global trend. It's not just in mature countries, say in the US or in Asia, that mobile is now the dominating way of accessing the internet. It's actually also true for other parts of the world. It's a global truth. In general, the globality, the global dimension of what's happening of the world, of communication as well, of information flow, that is something that is true by definition for the entire world. Also immediacy, that information can travel much faster than it used to. That's universally true. The importance of usability, of ease of use of technology is something that is shared by everyone. It's important to us. It's important to it's important in the same way to anyone, in any country, in any region. And kind of fitting into usability, also speech. The rise of speech is something that is common, especially again if we think of literacy. Of course, it's important to people with low literacy levels to be able to consume information in speech, or to communicate with devices through speech technology. Just as it is, more assumed as the preferred usability scenario for in developed countries. But linguistic complexity can also create problems. So not only, on the one hand, we have this convergence, and it seems like it's great. We just need to continue with our technological progress and everything will be fine. But actually, depending how this progress is managed, we can actually, we have the risk of widening the what's called the digital divide. And I'll explain a little bit what I mean by that. So when language technology and it's combined with technology can actually widen the digital divide is, for instance, between language communities. So communities whose languages are supported in terms of technology versus those languages where that's not the case. It's say again, if we talk about speech technology or machine translation, if it makes a big difference if a community can leverage certain types of technologies and others can't because they don't speak the language. That's maybe the most obvious of it. But it's also within communities, because of course communities are not completely homogeneous, and you have class, for instance, and a certain class of people within a community that will have a better access to education, say in English, in addition to their language, and they will of course be favored by this ability, and that it will widen the divide, the digital divide within a community, and potentially create tensions. And then it's also within these groups, and I mentioned already, I think, the difference of literacy in some country between men and women. It's again something where we, if we don't manage this, we actually have a risk of increasing this difference rather than using technology to even things out. We actually give more means to those who have access to education, or to have received, have learned to read and write. But also, the younger versus the older generation. We cannot just assume that everything will be fine because the younger generation generally tends to receive better education. There's still an older education that also has the same rights and maybe even more needs in terms of access to information, say in crisis situation than the younger generation. And the same holds, of course, for disabled versus enabled populations. Which for the work we're doing is really important. It's generally important, but for the work we're doing is particularly important. So that sometimes these are aspects that we're confronted with, and that sometimes when we're thinking just about technology, they're maybe not so obvious. I've just seen that. We've just been at the localization conference, and we've been talking a lot about language and how language technology, for instance, we're moving machine translation from statistical to neural machine translation, and people basically are saying it's the end of all the other paradigms that we used in machine translation. But we're talking about a technology that's basically available for 4 or 5, well, maybe a few more for languages. But we have thousands and thousands of languages spoken by people who need access to information, who have no chance of reaching this type or following this type of technological evolution at all, and even in an industry that by definition cares about language, focuses on those languages where these things are possible. But we need to be reminded that there is the vast majority of languages spoken by actual people, can't benefit from these technologies. So, and the type of technology that, how things have been evolving, I can't really speak about the neural, and that's actually something I would like to learn from you here as well, is how far the data dependency is something that maybe we can expect to be reduced as we move, say, into more deep learning types of technologies. But the data-driven technologies can actually augment these adverse effects that I just mentioned, because there's no data to build technology in many of these languages, And if there's data, then it may be in different scripts, and it's not even, and if people have not been taught in school how to spell, it may be very well, as people call it, dirty data. And at the same time, there's no tech to build the data. And then there's no business case to build the data and the tech. So it's a vicious circle that really stops these language communities from benefiting from the technological progress. And it's at the same time it's a vicious circle within another vicious circle, because the lack of access to information I was mentioning earlier means also there's a lower use of technology. And that further reduces the business case. If people don't use, say, mobile phones to do speech because the technology doesn't exist or is only accessible to English speakers, then it will actually make, again, reduce, say, a market potential, and it will then thereby also reduce your possibility, your ability to collect data. So it's, there are several effects that will penalize really efforts to develop things. So it's a couple of vicious circles that integrate or that feed into each other. So what are mitigating strategies? This kind of more of a problem statement so far. So in general, because this is not necessarily restricted to language, some of these phenomena. So that we've seen in other contexts that there are stopgap technology, sometimes outdated, generally considered outdated technologies that actually can be useful in these situations, rather than, say, waiting for a market to reach a certain level of maturity so that they can follow the path. There may actually be other technologies that can still be useful in these situations, and there can be alternative strategies and also unique opportunities. Again, instead of hoping to replicate what has been going on in other markets. So some examples are quite well known. Is this in Africa, the development of the mobile phone infrastructure, which kind of supersedes or means that the development of a traditional telecommunication infrastructure is just not necessary. And that's, what's interesting as well, these things often happen by themselves. It's not like there was a central organization that decided that there should be, mobile should be favored instead of a centralized telecommunication structure. Similar for mobile payments. In Africa, mobile payment was adopted much earlier than anywhere else, and it's text-based, SMS-based, and that's come from within those countries. There was an opportunity there that someone from the outside would not have identified. And drones, I think, is an interesting, maybe less well-known example. I've heard about that in Switzerland, where there is some of the universities a lot of work on drones, and who also look into implementations of drone technology in Africa. And they've discovered that one of the interesting aspects of drones in Africa is that it circumvents some of the rogue, what do you call it, police stops, where you may have to bribe someone in order to have the right to go further, and the drones just avoid this entire problem. And it's a big plus in order to facilitate commerce. Is actually just you avoid road traffic, and you can commerce freely.
So you attach your package to the drone, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. So drone delivery, a bit like it's tried here for other reasons. There it has a big plus because of let's call it the political reality in some of those countries.
So they're actually doing this in Africa?
There are projects doing this. Yeah. There are projects. Don't ask me about the details. It's not really about language, so I'm not involved yet. Who knows? Maybe there will be some language interaction with.
There are projects where they're delivering medicine and first aid kits.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, there's the whole thing that gets
Sorry?
talked about with.
Can you repeat for the recording also?
Okay. Yeah. So Diane just said there are projects delivering medical aid and can't remember, but basically medical aid.
First aid and medicines, things like that.
Yeah, medicine and first aid. Mm-hmm. So part of what so in terms of technological strategy, there is also then for those who want to help is to create conditions so that such solutions can emerge locally. So it's not to necessarily to develop sophisticated plans from the outside how some solution could be implemented. It's also help. We need to help create the conditions where people can actually take these initiatives and have the means to develop solutions themselves. And so applying that to Translators Without Borders, I've got a list of things and examples. So for us, that means, for instance, we need to build partnerships. We're small, we're an NGO, with limited financial abilities, of course, and we anyway depend on partnerships to develop our action. And our focus is then on developing partnerships where there is no business case or limited business cases. And there's some examples, including we have been working with Microsoft on building Swahili machine translation or Haitian Creole machine translation right now as part of the Matthew typhoon crisis. We've got again volunteers who help with updating this machine translation. So we have also been working with the United Nations Refugee Council on translation needs, or Ushahidi Translation API. That's actually an organization from Kenya, if I'm not wrong. So that's one way of how we would try to address this. Other examples, and this is now very concrete, very concrete activities. Is we just developed a rules-based machine translation system for Central Kurdish, actually for 2 Kurdish languages. Some people would argue they're dialects. That generally they're considered dialects, but the speakers consider them different languages, and they use different scripts as well. And that was done as part of a European refugee crisis program. Essentially, we tried to demonstrate the feasibility of a rapid crisis machine translation system in underserved languages using, what I would call stopgap technology. It's good old rules-based technology. So basically, 2 generations behind compared to what is going on elsewhere, say in English, Chinese machine translation. Another example also of stopgap technology approach is to record spoken translations for low literacy audiences where there is no speech tech. And that's precisely something we've been discussing here today. Something where we're working together with Microsoft. And part of this strategy is also to think of the data that we may need in the future to build, for instance, speech technology or that other types of technology, so that we're, as a byproduct, we can obtain the data that is dearly needed. So that's an essential aspect of this strategy. The impact, the benefit of doing these things is there immediately, but if we do it right, we also lay the ground basically for the ability of developing other technologies in the future. So with data-driven technology in mind. Another aspect is again this idea of actually creating the conditions so that locally people can develop solutions themselves. We're trying to empower local communities by using open source technology or free access to data, say like in the Microsoft Humanitarian Cloud. It's the same idea, is if we open the data and the technology, we also give people there the ability to decide themselves, experiment maybe, sometimes also make mistakes maybe, to come up with their own solutions. So that's what we did for this Kurdish machine translation solution. It's open source, so that the community itself can actually pick it up and develop it further if they want, but also repurpose it. So the first thing I heard from people who took part in this machine translation project is said, great, we'll use this as a spell checker. We hadn't thought of that. I'm not saying that a spell checker has, essential humanitarian impact, but it's part of maybe what will help you build consistent data later that you may need when you want to develop machine translation or so, because that's one of the challenges in some of these languages that aren't taught in school, is that the spelling is all over the place. So if this helps indirectly, and we hadn't even thought of that, if that helps indirectly get us cleaner data, it will be beneficial for everyone, including, of course, for commercial applications. I think this is actually also in line with what the IT industry in general has been doing in supporting education, giving, say, free license to education. The idea is also to create the conditions where people can essentially generate a market, and the market will have its own commercial benefits. and dynamic. So and I'm slowly but surely coming to the end as well here. So some concrete examples of technology that's really specifically talking about my role now as well is, so we're working on, we're just deploying a centralized translation management system that happens to be open source. Initially, that was not really what we had in mind, but we had a discussion with, in Guinea, as part of this Guinea project, with local partners there, and they actually felt particularly strong about us using a web-based but open source technology, because they felt that there is potential there for people there building something up and maybe creating some type of translation, what do you call it, a group of translators. So not necessarily a company, but create a cooperative or something like this translation. Yeah, because I'm here at Microsoft, I thought I should mention that we're using Azure as the infrastructure there, and we're also using the Microsoft Translator API, both with the generic engines and our own custom engines as part of this translation technology solution. And yeah, that was the last example, and I think we come at the end of the time as well. I was going to leave some time for questions. I don't know if that still is possible.
There's plenty of time for questions.
Oh, okay, good.
Mirko,
Mhm.
I like
You,
some.
hold on, you should repeat the question again, just as a reminder.
Okay, yeah, I will do, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about the tension between helping populations that are in need versus helping populations that might feel like the refugees are getting all of the attention, and there's sort of a balancing act there about exposing people to training or information or education through technology, or maybe not.
So the question was about tensions between different communities, say refugees, for instance, versus communities that are affected by other types of crises, right?
Well, so when we go in and we help refugees and we educate them and skill them, are we going to run into problems with other populations who say, how come the refugees get all the training and the skilling up as opposed to a population that doesn't?
So I'm certainly aware of tensions of this type between, in general, even within refugees as well, within groups of refugees. I've not heard of language or translation or language-specific aspects of that. Of course, people feel very strong about their language identity. So this Kurdish machine translation project that I mentioned, is a very, very. I mean, we did that with a group of 10 translators who we had selected, who worked, as a full-time activity of a couple of weeks on this project. They were really proud of the work that they were doing. Now, language is political, and Kurdish is very sensitive politically. And I could imagine that there might be issues. I know that's not really what you were asking about, but it's never just considered by everyone as good. There can be challenges. I think in Turkey, Kurdish is again, as a language, is not necessarily. I think there has been some progress recently. I think there's a TV station now that is allowed to broadcast a couple of hours a week or so in Kurmanji, so the Kurdish language spoken there. But it's very, very regulated and very restricted. So that's a sensitive topic. So far, yeah, I'm not aware of situations where, say, one language community would say, how come, actually, well, one example comes to mind actually in Arabic. We've had discussions about dialects and why we're doing standard Arabic versus or classic Arabic versus say Syrian, and or Egyptian versus Moroccan or so. And so there have been questions there, and I sometimes wondered if they're a little bit loaded, these questions. But otherwise, yeah, I can't really think of examples there.
Do you have any ideas about how communities that don't have language resources can generate language resources? So I was traveling last year and spent a bunch of time in Malawi.
Mm-hmm.
In Malawi, the official language is English. There's two official languages, English and Chichewa, which
Mm-hmm.
is the Bantu language that most people speak.
Mm-hmm.
When I came back, I was like, okay, I'm going to make a Chichewa translator so that people can access resources in English. And there's no data. The government has, this huge website, parliament proceedings and all that,
Mm-hmm.
everything's in English. And yet there are like TV stations and radio stations, and I'm wondering, like, do you guys have any ideas around like ways for people to easily create digital data, monolingual or bilingual, in order that we could build these systems so that they can.
So yeah, I think translation, I mean, maybe not surprisingly for an organization called Translators Without Borders, translation I think is a very powerful and obvious mean to create data in some of these languages. But I mean that's why we train translators, and we want to help build translation ecosystems, and we also try to help people make a business of it, make a living of it, and also we're talking to the industry and telling them, use these translators, translate your content, your product documentation, or if it's relevant, of course, into those languages. Use these people. There is a market that you can develop, and that means also that we'll develop data. Otherwise, I mean, I think it depends generally really on a specific situation, and it may be political. You may have universities. I don't know the situation in Mali. You may have universities, and universities may be interested in collaborating on creating things, or there may not be. There may be political reasons why they can't, and you may be able to find strategies how to do something. Through some projects that maybe have some other official purpose, but as a byproduct will create data. I don't think there's a silver bullet answer for this, but for us, translation is definitely a key aspect of it. Mm-hmm. Any more questions? Yeah.
You had mentioned your training systems on the hub.
Yeah.
I know you have a Swahili system.
Yeah.
What other languages are you training?
So we've been training for French actually.
Oh, okay.
It's and Arabic. We've not used that in production yet in Arabic, but these are the systems that we have been training. Yeah, it's really a question of the data that we have as well. Because I'm aware. I mean, sometimes the generic system is already, you can feed it data, but if it's not enough data to make a difference, we might as well use the generic data.
You're building domain specific?
Domain organization specific. So for Doctors Without Borders, for instance, we try to create a partner specific, if you will, organization specific translation translation engine. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's the type of thing where we also experiment a little bit. If it's health related, can we apply it elsewhere? But yeah, that's so. Doctors Without Borders is a big partners of ours, so that it made sense to have a system that is specific, dedicated to them. Mm-hmm.
Does Translators Without Borders have access to the content that we've translated to said majority languages? I mean, French is one of them. We certainly translated this as
It's all in the hub.
Okay, but I mean, we may not have given them explicit access to it. We should.
Something I did not mention explicitly is the speech API. So we're using the speech API as well. That's also part of the discussion we had today. So to generate for the languages for which there is text-to-speech, to generate spoken versions of the written translations, so that we can post them and make them available. I don't know if I mentioned that earlier, but say for radio broadcasts or so, where written distribution of written information may not be the preferred way of bringing information out there, so that organizations can just go and say, I use the spoken version of this rather than the written version, and because we can use the API, we can just by default make this available. And
We're adding more languages.
yeah, of course. Yeah, so that's.
And if anybody's interested, we're working with Mirko on an application that would allow people on the ground to create their own phrase books for speech on the fly. It's very narrow, supports any language pairs. If anybody's interested, we're sponsored by the Garage and the Philanthropies team. We would love to have some smart people from research involved in that.
So the people online didn't hear that. I don't know that Mirko wants to repeat it, but.
Mobile Speech Act.
Yeah, so we're working together on.
Yeah, you can. That's right, you guys can.
On mobile speech app. We just met today to kind of better describe the general use case, and with volunteers here from Microsoft.
You can email me, Diane.
And they should email Diane. Yeah, Diane Wagner, dianew@microsoft.com. Yeah, that's a really cool, exciting project that kind of fits in very nice into some of the things I've tried to bring across. Also, where technology, say the most advanced technology, is not ready yet. That we actually can do things. We don't have to wait until neural machine translation becomes available or speech recognition becomes available in all languages of the world before we can support people better and communities better in their needs. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Mirko.
Thank you.